Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode in the Suffer Well, Surrendering to Rest podcast series. Now, we are in a new month, February, and our guest speaker for tonight is a dynamic speaker, and I can't wait to hear more about her and share her bio and story. But before we do that, I want to share the meaning behind what suffer well really means. Suffer well means having the ability to navigate difficult circumstances and enduring hardships with grace. It means to find purpose behind adversity and challenges. It's viewing challenges as opportunities for growth. The tests, trials, and hardships is actually an invitation for developing resilience, hope for the future, refining your character, surrendering and trusting God in the process. It means to rise when life or the enemy tried its hardest to tear and break you down. It means not giving up in the process and finding your strength, your power, and light. So that is the meaning of suffer well. Joining us tonight is Miss Lena Wilson, a transition coach. Welcome, Miss Lena. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, Mia. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here. Hi, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much. And I just felt like it was so important and necessary, since we are talking about navigating life transitions, to bring a transition coach to talk to us about giving us advice and tools on how to navigate life transitions. No matter what type of transition or season you may be in, it's good to have those tools in our bag to help us when we are in a transition season.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to share Miss Lena Wilson's bio. Lena M. Wilson, as I mentioned, is a transition coach, 3-time author, and CEO of Real Inspiration. With 25 years of corporate HR experience, she helps midlife women process hidden grief, regain clarity, and confidently navigate major career and life transitions. She is the creator of the Transition Blueprint, a framework that blends strategy, emotional intelligence, and psychological safety to guide women through change. As a dynamic speaker and facilitator, Lena inspires audiences to rise with resilience and step into their next chapter with purpose. She is happily married for 13 years and lives in Central Florida, and is a proud mother of a beautiful teenage daughter. Yes, that is an amazing bio. And I don't know if I shared it with you, but I am in Baltimore, Maryland. And one thing that I shared in my previous episodes is that community doesn't just have to be in your city, your state. There's people that have gone through transitions even out of state that we can learn and we can gain insight from. So I'm really glad that I was able to reach out to you all the way in Florida.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you did.
Yes. So we just read your bio. Tell us, Lena, what your journey about becoming a transition coach, and explain what that title means for you in that role to help others.
Okay, well, let's start off with sharing kind of how I landed at this space. So I
Yes.
think much of what I consider to be my calling as a transition coach was really unfolded through my own lived experience. So I'll share, as Mia shared in my bio, I worked in corporate human resources for 25 years, and in each of my roles in HR, I coached in some capacity. So I was like a recruiter, I was a staffing manager, I worked in employee relations for about 13 years, and I also coached mid-level managers to become better leaders. So I've had like a wide array of roles in human resources, but I've always coached to some capacity. And I always found that people struggle through change.
Mhm.
It's sometimes very uncomfortable. So that's from the professional side. And then from a personal side, I have gone through my own personal transition. So becoming a transition coach was almost like the combination of my professional world and my personal world. And in my personal life, I went through, at the age of 18, I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, and I moved to United States. Now, I was born in the States, but I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago because I was adopted by West Indian parents. So that was like my first major transition, coming to United States after growing up in the Caribbean and really going through a significant culture shock. And then I would say like my next big transition that's kind of memorable for me, that really kind of shifted a lot of my life, would be when I went through a divorce, right? I went through a very painful divorce. And at the time when we separated, my daughter was only 9 months old. So it's kind of like that whole transition of becoming a single mom and navigating that space, and really just kind of what felt like in that moment watching your life kind of fall apart and not aligned with the dream. So that was like a really big transition for me, which really, I know we'll talk about it later on, but kind of birthed my purpose. And then the very last and most recent transition that I've navigated is actually leaving the corporate space. So kind of walking away from that 25 HR career to move more in alignment with what I consider to be my assignment here on earth, and to really flow and to operate in my purpose on a daily basis. And so I wanted to make a lot more impact kind of globally. I wanted to do a lot more things. And, when you're working in corporate, you do have some limitations in how that all flows. And so I wanted to have the freedom to make as much impact as I could as I kind of walk people through navigations. I think the second part of your question was what does that all mean? What is a transition coach, right? So a transition coach, and really what I do is I primarily work with midlife women. And I also work with organizations as well, but I work primarily with midlife women to really help them navigate major and difficult career and personal life transitions so that they can gain the clarity and the confidence to move forward in a purposeful way. Because sometimes when we go through major transitions, whether that's a divorce like what I went through, or empty nesting, or losing our job, it does rock our world significantly. And sometimes we freeze, sometimes we get stuck. And having a transition coach really helps you to have a safe space to be able to process all of those emotions, to help you kind of navigate where you are, where you need to go, and to help you with a plan to move forward so that you don't get stuck. So it's almost like having someone there to help you to process the ending, right? Because when you're in transition, it's generally the ending of something and the beginning of something new. But that middle space where that beginning hasn't quite manifested yet can be very uncomfortable. And we are in uncertainty, and there's the fear of the unknown and what's going to happen next. And so really helping you process the ending of something, but then helping you navigate that, what we call the messy middle, until, the next phase and season manifests.
Yes, absolutely. And I just, love how you were able to tie in from a personal perspective as well as with your professional, how you've always been coaching in some type of manner. You know what I mean? And that's letting me know and the audience know that what was birthed in you wasn't when you left, to go to pursue coaching. I don't know if it's full time or not, but just to be more aligned. And that's so beautiful because even in my journey, I felt so lost for so many years. And I transitioned out of the classroom. I taught for 15 years and I transitioned out of teaching, but I thought teaching was supposed to be a lifelong career, and I had no idea what I was doing, what I would do afterwards, right? Yeah. And I kept looking for jobs outside of the classroom because I do have a passion to teach, but then I realized that I was, and you're almost similar to yours, I was in some capacity coaching, whether it was helping my parents or my colleagues, just giving them encouragement and inspiration. I said, okay, I was already doing that, so now it's like, how do I turn this into not just like ideas, but actual business,
Yeah,
so.
absolutely. Yeah, I always say that no season or no experience that we gain is ever wasted.
Mhm.
And God has a way of just using all of what we acquire along the way to create something meaning and purposeful in our lives.
Yes, absolutely. And that's where the whole background of Suffer Well came, because when that phrase was dropped in my spirit a few years ago, I had to pray and ask God, like, what does that mean? How can you suffer well? But that's why I wanted to start off the episode by explaining what suffer well means, that, like, yes, we navigate difficult circumstances, but once we have developed the tools, we're able to navigate it with grace. We're able to see it as an opportunity for growth,
Absolutely.
and oftentimes our hardships, our tests that we go through actually makes room for something greater to come, like you said, at the end. But it's when we're in that middle, and I even posted that recently at the beginning of this new year, that, like, I don't know why in the middle, it's like, it just seems so, like, uncertain and messy,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that
Yeah.
support is definitely needed. So thank you so much for
Yeah,
helping others in that transition, because we need more, coaches in that
absolutely.
area. So offline, I believe I shared with you that when I did my season 1, like, I didn't have a lot of details, when God gave me the idea, I just kind of went with it. And I found, my guest speakers, not really found them, but they have helped me directly and indirectly, meaning directly, I had my pastor come on. I had, to make a long story short, I had my life coach that helped me when I was in the middle stages.
Okay.
Come on to be a guest speaker. So they helped me directly, but then indirectly were women that I've just been following for years on social media that have talked about their story, and I brought them on. But the topic that I had the most hardest time finding somebody was for grief and loss. Like, how can we, talk about that? Because I'm learning that when we are experiencing grief and loss, or just how do we find joy in that moment, But prayerfully, luckily, I was able to find a guest speaker, this is last season now.
Mhm.
And as I'm reflecting on my previous guest speakers, guess what? All of them have shared their experiences of how they were able to navigate that season of their life when they were experiencing their own versions of grief and loss, and how they were able to bounce back and rebuild. So the question that I have for you is, because I believe in your bio, you mentioned that you help your clients, you coach women that may be dealing with a type of grief. So what tools do you share with them to help them with dealing with a type of grief, any type of grief?
Yeah, so I think it would be helpful, Mia, to kind of share kind of how the grief coaching came along, because I'm actually a grief coach, but
Oh, okay.
yeah, I say transition coach because the grief coaching is secondary. So I've always kind of done some type of coaching through transitions, but what I started to find more so when I started my own business a couple years ago, well, I didn't start the business, but I went full time from corporate. I've always kind of been coaching in my business while I still worked in the corporate space. But what I started to really see is that when, remember I talked about a little bit a while ago about it's the ending, right? A
Yeah.
transition usually is symbolic of something ending and something beginning. And I found that people were having very high emotions, very heightened emotions, roller coaster of emotions, and they didn't realize that it was grief. Right. So, grief, when we hear the word grief, we often think about grief as the death of someone.
Mhm.
But grief, in essence, is any meaningful loss that happens in our life. And we can grieve whatever that loss is. However, many people didn't identify what they were dealing with as a loss, so they couldn't really conceptualize that they were actually grieving. And so once I recognized that, I thought it was a good idea for me to equip myself to better help people cope through the piece of grief. So that's kind of how that came along. Transitions and grief really kind of go hand in hand in most cases, right? And so here's what I would say in terms of how do you navigate, or how I help people navigate grief. First of all, there are some people, and many of us, I certainly was one of those individuals when I was going through my own process, where we feel the emotions, but we try to suppress it and we try to bury it because either it's too painful, life is going by too quickly, and we don't realize that, hey, we need to pause and process what's happening. So the first thing I would say is that you have to acknowledge that there is grief taking place. Like, there is a loss here, there is grief taking place, and you have to give yourself permission to acknowledge that so that you can process it. How do you process it? Well, the second thing that you have to do is you have to name what that loss is. So it's not enough to say like, oh, I'm just grieving or this hurts. No, what's the loss that you are experiencing, right? So like when I was going through my divorce, the loss was my loss of family, the loss of a dream in terms of what I thought my family structure would look like, the loss of my daughter not having her dad in the home. You have to name the loss, because the more that you can name the loss, the more you're able to manage the loss, right? And so it's kind of like what they say, you can't heal what you don't reveal. It is so important that you name that loss. And some people don't know how to get to that space. So as a transition coach, I ask the right questions to help them uncover what those different layers of loss is as it relates to that transition. So once you name it, once you acknowledge it, then you name it, then you now have the hard work of really processing all of that. Because if you're not careful, grief will keep you in a very dark space for a long time. So you have to make the decision that I am going to manage this grief. I'm going to give myself permission to go through all the emotions, but then I have to do things intentionally to make sure I'm helping myself to move forward. So, releasing what you feel, whether that's through journaling, whether that's through your faith, if you are a person of faith, and asking God to help you kind of manage what's going on, whether it's, pausing long enough, because some of us, we're not still enough. So busy. We live in such a busy, noisy world that you have to intentionally pause and be still to allow yourself to process what's happening. And then utilizing some of those tools, like I said, making sure you're journaling and you're writing and you're praying and whatever brings you the most peace, because when you find peace in those moments, you'll get clarity, right? You'll get the clarity and you'll get kind of that resolve so that you can move forward.
Yes. And thank you so much for breaking that down, because it is so necessary. And as you mentioned, grief and transition, they really do go hand in hand, because you are experiencing losses. And when I had the episode last year where we talked about grief and joy, we had shared that endings is necessary when you're on a transition journey. You are going to experience that loss. But even myself, Lena, I didn't realize I was grieving until I started working on the project last year. Because I just thought it was.
I didn't learn that. I didn't know I was grieving when I got divorced. Yeah.
Because like you said, I thought grief was just when somebody physically dies, but it's the loss of a dream. It's so many different types of grief that was just layers on top of the anger and the frustration, all those other emotions. And like you mentioned, it's so hard to sit in your feelings and be uncomfortable. So we just process it by just staying busy. But then I learned, even on my journey, is this an escape? Is this an avoidance? What is it? So I had to really sit with my coach and dig deep to find out what that is. Because like you said, like, you have to do the work,
Yeah, you do. And the thing about, because you said a powerful word like avoidance and suppression, like a lot of people do that. And the one thing that I help clients to understand is that even though you may think, oh, I'm suppressing this, I'm moving along, your body is always keeping score of what's happening internally. So sometimes, when I'm working with clients, they're like, oh, I have these headaches, my stomach is in a knot, I can't sleep, I can't eat. Well, your body is responding to the grief. However, right? It's not going to, regulate itself until you acknowledge what's going on so you can help align all of that to move forward. And so, you kind of do, or we kind of collectively do ourselves a disservice when we don't pause to process that grief, because then it's compounded by now physical ailments because manifested in different ways in our body.
And part of the podcast, we are talking about rest. We're talking about also because life is challenging, whether you're in a transition or not. Oftentimes we're carrying so many hats. We're wearing so many hats, and, we're just trying to juggle and just get through from one day to the next, without really sitting and like you mentioned, processing what it is that we're going through. So you may have touched on this a little bit, but from a personal and even from a professional standpoint, when you feel yourself possibly getting a little bit worked up or overwhelmed due to, the heaviness of your week, not even just life, but just the heaviness of your week. What are some ways that you bring peace into your life or manage those emotions?
Yeah, so I'm gonna try to share kind of my response from a practical perspective, because I have worked very hard on managing and protecting my peace over the years. And so I always try to answer this question when I'm asked from a more realistic perspective, because I don't think the average person has done as much work as I've done to kind of stay in a state of peace. Doesn't mean I don't get frazzled, but the first thing for me, especially after I got divorced, was I realized at that point that I wanted to make a change in my life, because I was so emotionally broken that peace was something that was very distant for me. And I realized that without peace in my life, I don't have joy. And those two things were very important for me, because I knew what that had felt like before, and I knew what it felt when it wasn't there. And so peace is something that I have always made a high priority. So if you ask me, when life feels heavy, what are some things that you can do? I do think it's important to ground yourself in some way. Now, your audience may have different backgrounds. I am a Christian, so for me, grounding myself is usually prayer, it's usually worship, it's usually reading my Bible. For other people, that may look like some other form of meditation. It could be walking, it could be sitting, near water, whatever that might look like for you. I actually intentionally moved to Florida because peace for me is being near beaches and lots of sunshine, right? So you have to know what are the things that really ignite your peace. That can look different for each of us, and intentionally pursue that. People always laugh because they don't believe, you actually moved because you wanted to be in sunshine and beaches. I did. When I got divorced, I redesigned my entire life. And here's the thing I would say about peace. We all have the ability to create a life that we love. We're not really taught that a lot, at least I wasn't. But you don't have to live life by default. You can create a life that you love. And I think part of it is, what you're asking me is determining what brings me joy and what brings me peace, and then pursue those things relentlessly in your life. And don't compromise on what you desire. As long as it's in alignment with where God is leading you, don't compromise on your standards. I think sometimes we settle for less than what we desire, and we go into situations of chaos and confusion for different reasons. Yeah. And so if I had to sum it up, here's what I would say. Peace in your life is having the courage to remove anything or anyone that does not fit.
Yes, I love that.
Very simply put.
Say that one more time, Lena.
Yeah. To achieve peace in your life, it's simply removing anything or anyone in your life that does not fit or no longer fits.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
That's how you achieve peace. Yeah.
And within the last 2 years, I've been saying, let go of anything that no longer serves you. Yes. And that's what helps me to find my peace. Things in my schedule, I had to learn how to prioritize, because my mind is so busy, and that's a talk for another day, but it's like it's always on a go, go, go. So I had to prioritize my peace, my rest, and like there's different forms of rest that depending on the week or the month or the season I'm in, I listen to my body. And that was something that we talked about last episode. But I just loved how you said that, being intentional. And you intentionally moved to Florida to be near the beaches and water because that's the place, possibly your safest place, your happy place.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think sometimes we are so focused on pleasing the people around us. And in doing that, we sacrifice our own peace and our own happiness, right? And so that's why even when I said, let go of anything or anyone, sometimes it's the people that we care about that don't, to your point, don't serve us very well, or they don't help or aid in fueling our peace. They do the opposite, and it does take courage sometimes to walk away from certain situations or certain friendships. But you have to do what brings you the most peace and not worry about disappointing other people. And for people who are people pleasers, that is very difficult, right? I always say like I'm a recovering people pleaser, right? But when you are a people pleaser, you struggle with releasing things and releasing people because you feel like, hey, I need to make everyone around me happy. But most people that are people pleasers, they're doing it at their own detriment. Right? Sacrificing their own wellness overall.
Right, absolutely. And it is difficult because even for myself, I was a people pleaser. I was a yes person to everything, especially when it came to work. And I was taking on other people's responsibilities and they were dumping it on me to the point that I'm like, okay, I'm extremely overwhelmed. If I'm doing this, what work are you doing? So, and it was like that cycle for years, for like almost 10 years. And I kept saying, God, there has to be something else for me because this is not healthy. This is not where I see myself, 20 years from now, like I want to be happy now, not in retirement age when I'm in my 60s. I was in my 30s at that time feeling this way. I'm like, I still have a long way to go before retiring, like how can I create the life that I love now, not in my 60s 30 years later.
Well, I'm glad that you found the courage to do that because a lot of people don't. They just kind of settle.
Yes, it was the biggest leap of faith, but one thing I'm learning on my journey, and I'm still learning it, because healing is something is ongoing. It's something that we're doing to evolve and growth. And that's one thing I said, I look at it as this opportunity, as growth, those challenges. I took a leap of faith. I wouldn't recommend anybody else to do that, but I honestly didn't have a plan. But I knew because of my strong faith, I knew that something had to be better, because when we're making those big decisions, I'm listening to how does my body feel when I'm at work or just in those difficult situations. Does my body feel safe when I'm praying about it? Do I feel at peace? So I'm a very reflective person. I'm asking those questions and journaling, and I'm listening to God like, okay, you can do this, and like you said, like just trusting God over man. When I say man, meaning people, because I didn't tell anybody because I knew they were going to talk me out of it, So, and that was years ago. And
I think the thing also that people need to understand is like peace is not the absence of adversity. It's not the absence of uncertainty. It's not the absence of, things happening around you. It's your ability to navigate those spaces well with grace, even though those things are kind of happening. And I think sometimes when people think about peace, they think, oh, life is just wonderful and smooth and without any issues. And the reality is that's not reality, first of all, right? There's always going to be something happening, but you can still have peace in the midst of adversity and uncertainty. And if you're deep rooted in faith like yourself and like myself, that's your anchor, right? And so you have to figure out what's your anchor and allow that to guide you through those moments of uncertainty until it settles, because it will settle.
I loved how you just mentioned that. Absolutely. And recently, I did a meditation. I posted it on my page for embracing and accepting change. So I'll tell a background story. In 2019, I thought that was my year of, yes, my year of building. But that was the year that I actually broke down completely. And I was so burnt out. I cried out and I started seeking, all the help that I could get from a Christian counselor and from a life coach. And that's when I really started to put the work together. And I believe in, in the churches, and sometimes they say, the number 7 is completion. That was 7 years ago, so now it's like his plans is starting to really unfold for me. And I'm noticing that, like, when we are in those really tough situations, when you are uncertain or feel uncertain, you don't know like what's going to happen, unknown. Like, I'm learning on my journey as I continue that, like you mentioned, everything serves a purpose. And I had to be broken down so that way I can be reshaped and really speak from a place of authenticity when it comes to, because this is a topic that I'm passionate about now, because I'm actually going through it and I'm my first student. So that way when if God directs me to work with other women, I can say, you know what, I've lived through this also transition, and here's the advice that I will give. So I'm just really appreciative for you sharing your journey, because I was one that felt alone and isolated because nobody in my circle was able to relate to what I was going through. Yeah. But I feel like you said, everything serves a purpose, but I had to be broken down to be reshaped. Yeah. And that was I feel like I have that confidence and peace.
That was a year before the pandemic that you were
Yes. Yes.
So I can only imagine then you have the pandemic, and but God is faithful. So, I love how he just brings all the pieces together.
Absolutely.
For a bigger purpose. And sometimes, those darker spaces lead us to purpose, because I can tell you, when I went through my divorce, I have not had a darker experience in my life. And that's even from dealing with the loss of both of my parents from cancer. That was hard, but I also dealt with that. But the divorce was really, really difficult. And that was how I became a life coach, through that experience, because I realized that so many women get stuck in the pain of, whatever they go through. And I said after that experience, I wanted to help as many women as I can to reach back and pull them out of their spaces of pain, because it doesn't matter what you go through and how hard it feels and how difficult it looks. Like, you can heal and God always restores, but you have to be willing to do the work to get there. So
absolutely,
purpose is always birthed through those hard experiences.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads me into my next question, because when I think about joy and how you had mentioned in your response earlier about peace, like, peace is not the absence of, storm. Like, you can still find peace even if you're going through a dark season or a difficult situation. And that's how I picture joy as well. Oftentimes when people see somebody on a beach, they're thinking, life is probably happy and everything's going good, but you're probably still going through something even though you're at the beach, right? Absolutely. So using that example, how can we thrive during change?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I try to really teach and help people understand is that change is inevitable. We can't escape it, right? And we're always going through transitions. Like, when you go from kindergarten to first grade, like, transitions start really early in life, right? Really, really early. And so I think the first thing that you have to understand is that change is inevitable. And the more that you accept that versus resisting it, the easier it is for you to thrive through it. Sometimes people are not able to thrive through it because they're spending so much of their energy resisting it or not dealing with the realities of what's happening with the change. You can't thrive if you're not managing something well. It's just not possible. And so even with the work that I do and helping women to thrive through it is helping them to understand that even though this change might be uncomfortable, there's always usually something better on the other side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can thrive through change by really accepting the fact that this is how we grow, this is how we transform, this is how we evolve, this is how we move closer to purpose. And nothing beautiful is ever birthed in an easy way. It just doesn't happen, you know. I have a butterfly tattoo, and I love butterflies because it symbolizes transformation
Mm-hmm.
and change, right? If you think about all that a butterfly goes through to become a butterfly, it is an ugly process, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is a very ugly process. And it's no different with us, right? We have to accept that, hey, this feels uncomfortable, this feels hard, but here are the things that I can do to get through it. So the thriving piece really comes in, how do I manage my mindset, right? When you were doing my bio, you mentioned kind of the transition blueprints, which is my signature framework. And so that really encompasses helping you thrive through it by managing your mindset, understanding what are your thoughts about this change and what are the thoughts that we need to shift about this change. We also talk about how do you regulate your emotions, because those emotions will jack you up if you don't get them under control, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that your feelings are going to change. Your feelings are not facts, but it does feel like it in the moment, right? So how do you regulate your emotions? And then really, how do you build your resilience? That's something, believe it or not, it's part of my framework, because if you're dealing with a really difficult change, let's just say you lost your job, for example, you got laid off, you wasn't expecting it. You know, if you weren't expecting that level of loss and you don't know how to navigate that, if you don't build your resilience back or build it up, you won't know how to bounce back from that loss.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about your mindset, your feelings, but it's also about how do you build your resilience so that you don't crumble every time something happens or changes in your life. Because it is life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to, you know, learn how to build your resilience, but then it's also, you thrive through change by figuring out where you are, where would you like to go, and what's the work you need to do in between.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really kind of where my superpower is, I like to say, is how we come up with kind of a strategic plan to get from here to there. Because once you start building momentum, you start rebuilding your confidence, which is something we also talk about in that framework. When you start rebuilding, when you start gaining momentum and you start building your confidence and you have the clarity, then you can thrive through it, because you're no longer sitting in your feelings, feeling stuck, not knowing kind of what's going to happen next. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how you thrive through it. Now, I get that everyone doesn't have that framework, or they don't have the, you know, the blessing of working with me. And so what I would say is, if I had to give like a general prescription for how do you thrive through change, it's really understanding what the change is. It's understanding where you are, locate yourself emotionally. That's a big piece. And really figure out, okay, based on what has happened, where would you like to go? And what is it going to take for you to get there, so that you're always moving forward. And moving forward doesn't mean I have to take these big leaps at a time.
Right.
Depending on what you're going through or what the change is, moving forward could be, I just need to do the very next best thing. I need to focus on what I'm going to do in the next moment, not what I'm going to do in the next year, right? And sometimes when change happens, we feel like, oh my gosh, we're so overwhelmed because we're trying to figure out, what am I going to do in the next 12 months? No, you just focus on what you're going to do in the next hour. And
Right.
right? And do that thing. And then once you do that thing, okay, what are you going to do in the next hour? Because sometimes you really do have to take it moment by moment until you regain that confidence and the momentum to move forward in a faster way.
Yes, yes. I just loved everything. And, you know, it's so important, like you mentioned, like that mindset. So like I had, listening to you explain your framework, I had wrote my book because like God shifted me. I thought I was writing a children's book, but he wanted me to write, you know, a book about me. And I'm like, well, I haven't made it yet. But anyways, to make a long story short, the title was the subtitle, To Build Your Mental and Spiritual Muscles. And then I created a title. And when I was in the editing stage, my spirit told me to add confidently. So I said, what the title originally was, into your new season. But then when I was editing the book, my spirit said, no, add confidently. Because when you are in a transition season, you're feeling everything but confidence.
Yes.
And I was reflecting, this was probably at the end of this past year, 2025, going into the new year. Mm-hmm. And I said, wow, I've been talking about how I'm walking boldly and confidently, but deep down I'm not, because I'm still showing up with, anxiety, showing up with fear, not sure, because I don't like doing public speaker. And I'm like, God, do you not know who I am? I'm an introvert, but he's really been stretching me, and it's truly been uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But he's like, will you just trust me? So my thing is, how can we navigate during the transitions? And having that framework really does, like what you created, helps with that transformation and that change. Mm-hmm. Because you shouldn't have to navigate it on your own.
Yeah. And so, some people don't realize that they need a transition coach.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so, if you're going through any form of change and you're struggling through that, that's probably an indication that you need a transition coach. But I will say, one of the things that I hear a lot from my clients is the safety. That is a big piece, right? So I teach a lot on emotional intelligence and psychological safety. But people can thrive through change when they feel safe. And if that safety is not there, then they don't always feel confident, like you said, to really take the right steps. And so safety is important when you're navigating change, and to apply it very practically, that means, am I safe when I talk to this person about what I'm going through? Is this person going to offer me the right level of support and feedback? And if not, then maybe I shouldn't talk to this person, right? Mm-hmm. Am I safe sharing my vulnerable feelings about this struggle that I'm in? And if I'm not safe, then I'm not going to do that, right? And when people don't feel safe, then they tend to hold everything in, and they don't share, and they don't seek out help because they're afraid that they're going to be judged, and they're afraid that people are going to criticize them, and what, you're leaving your job, what like right. Because, and they don't understand, right? And so safety is a very important part of navigating change and being able to thrive through it as well.
Wow, I love that. And just knowing that, yes, that is so true. When you feel emotionally safe, emotionally well, it makes total sense when you explain it like that, to be able to thrive, because I didn't journal when I was a kid, because when I was young, I grew up in a large family. I had all my cousins. I had all of my friends. We can talk about life. But then I noticed when I was in my late 20s and 30s, when life was happening for me, they were not available. Yes, I could call them, but they weren't necessarily available to hear what I was going through, So it made me feel alone. And this was literally 3 years ago. I had to pray, and God kept saying surrender. And I'm like, what am I supposed to surrender? Like I kept praying for years. What am I supposed to surrender? And he kept saying, you need to rest. How do I rest? Because when life is happening, the last thing you're going to do is go to sleep. Your mind is not. Your mind is not going to sleep. So that's why I had to learn and find out what rest looks like for me. And he shared it with me, what rest looks like, because even as you mentioned, being near water, I love being near water. It's just something about that. It's just a release for me, and I feel like I'm going off a little bit, but I just want to share and resonate that, yes, it's so true. And I've never connected that to the safety part, because when I think about safety, I think about oh, am I going out by myself? Am I safe physically, but emotionally, how can I be safe?
Yeah, it's a whole thing. I teach a whole workshop on psychology.
Oh, I need to come to that workshop. I do.
Yeah, it's a whole thing.
And I had to surrender. I had to write down in my journal, what are some things I needed to surrender? So one of them was surrendering my timeline, because one of my losses that I experienced was I was with somebody that I thought somebody I was going to marry, and I was holding on to that person for years, 7 to 8 year marriage, because I thought it was leading to a marriage. But I came to realization that oh, this man is not going to marry me, and I had to walk away from that. But I was in a stage where I'm in my late 20s, early 30s. All of my friends have babies now. All of my friends are married now. But what is me? And they were with their significant other much less than that. and they got married, you know? So like I had to surrender the comparison because that was just like a thief, you know, like he comes to steal, kill, and destroy, you know, that comparison. So I really had to do some inner work and release that. And so many things I had to release, but I focused so much on my losses that I didn't have the mindset to think about the growth, room for it, you know? So that's where I'm at now. Like this is an opportunity to expand because yes, the losses are there, but it's also room for growth. There's also room for joy. Joy is not meaning that like I could be having a really crazy day, a crazy month, but guess what? You're not going to take my joy away. You're not, you know? So
that is so powerful what you said about surrendering your timeline.
Yeah.
So many women have this, and unfortunately societal pressure contributes to that, but so many, you know, like I want to be married by this time, I want to have a child by this time, I want to be retiring, you know, and unfortunately it is something that we need to surrender. I mean, you could probably create like a whole workshop on that and do well, because it's definitely an area that many women struggle in. You know, create these timelines for ourselves, and when it doesn't happen, we think like it's the end of the world. So
right, and like I felt stuck for years because, like I said, nobody was able to relate with what I was feeling because at that time I turned 40 last year, but we didn't have language to call that grief. You know, because possibly we didn't know that was an example of grief. I didn't know until literally last year. so yeah. Oh yes, it's really important. And I just love the fact that that was birthed out of you, you know, from your professional and personal experiences that was birthed. And would you consider this to be now your purpose? Have you found your purpose, or what's that revealed to you as your purpose?
Yeah, I do. I definitely feel like I am doing what I've been called to do. I do think, you know, it's interesting that you asked me this because just today I was working on just outlining some things for my business. And I have I like working with women. I work with primarily midlife women, 40 plus. And as I was thinking about transitions, and it has to do with my daughter. So my daughter just turned 18 last week.
Okay.
And she's getting ready to go off to college. And I was thinking about just her transition that she's going to experience. And it just made me think that I don't know that, or I don't hear, right? Which is why I'm doing the research. I don't hear a lot of people talking about preparing our children for college or for the real world when they leave college. It's almost like you're thrusted into both of those environments and you're having to kind of figure it out, kind of like on the job training with no trainer. And so I was thinking when you asked me about my purpose, you know, I was just really just sitting with God and just saying, hey, is it that you want me to start, you know, expanding my transitions, not just to midlife women, but to these other places that really need that support, right? So I share that to say, I do feel I'm definitely walking in my assignment as a coach. I just think that as I continue to evolve, that could start to expand and take on a lot of different, you know, hands, so to speak. And I am in a very interesting place because I also support organizations when they go through restructuring and change, right? So it's like I have that element, but then I also have where I like to work with consumers and women and things like that. And then there's a corporate. So I'm still kind of operating in two separate lanes, but the framework is still the same in every single lane.
I love that. And I loved how you mentioned that, like, for that population, like expanding, because we, as you mentioned earlier, we go through many transitions from kindergarten all the way up to high school to now college life and like, or career readiness. And how do we transition our young adults to be, you know, successful young adults?
Yeah.
So I really think that's a necessary population.
Yeah, I do too. So I'll see how that unfolds. I'm always asking God to kind of guide me. I don't like to just do something because it sounds like a good idea. I need it to be a God idea for me.
Yes. I love that because even for myself, this was like years ago. People will say, you should do this, you should do that. You're right. You should write books about this and write books about that because my first book was a children's book and I struggled with anxiety and fear. So I said, well, you can still write a children's book because kids go through anxiety. And working in the school system, I felt more of a counselor, school social worker than a teacher because I was really helping them with regulating their emotions. And I said, yeah, that's a good idea. I'll pencil it in. But if God didn't give me that idea,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. You definitely want God to breathe and bless, the work of your hands. And so it's important, at least it's important for me, so I just write things down and then I pray through it and then I just kind of see. And then a lot of times somebody like, recently, right? So my husband and I, we also manage a vending business. So can you imagine like going from corporate HR and then not managing vending machines? Like talk about transition. That's a whole nother show, right?
Yes.
But my husband and I, we manage a vending machine business. And I was like, people ask me like, how did you get started and how do you do it? And I was thinking, I probably should do like a mini intro class just to help people because I get the question a lot. It's not something I talk about a lot because that's kind of more his thing. I just support him.
Yeah.
Is the coaching, transition coaching. And right as I thought that, Mia, like the very next day, somebody inboxed me and asked me, hey, I want to learn about vending. Hey, can I set up time with you so you can teach me how to start a vending? So that was like confirmation, right? Even though it's not like my main thing. I was thinking about it, and that was just for me. Okay, God, I hear you. Confirmation. I'll do the class, right? So I'm gonna do the class coming up in a couple weeks.
Yes. And also after hearing you, I also believe in everything happens in divine timing. So even when you get an idea, it's like praying on it and then waiting God to give you that confirmation to do that. And that's something that I do with my personal walk also, because I may get ideas and I'm like, okay, if I'm feeling frustrated, and if it's not flowing and aligning the way I think it should, then I'm like, okay, maybe I need to put it down for now. And then
his timing is definitely important. And that's when having a relationship, an intimate relationship with him matters. So that you can hear him clearly and not go off on your own path. Yes.
Right, absolutely. And I have a question that just came in my mind as we were talking, and stop me if the question doesn't make any sense. But the question that comes to my mind when you just mentioned as far as you also help corporate businesses as well as women navigating their personal lives. So many of us have lived during the pandemic and learned a lot about ourselves inward, and how we wanted to pivot during, the pandemic. And I can't believe that was 6 years ago. That's crazy that was 6 years. It still feels like it was yesterday.
It does.
But the question that I have, that question that's forming in my mind is, when you are working with corporate businesses, do you often see like the people talking to you about like their personal lives and wanting like advice, or do they come over to work with you as a personal client?
So I could probably answer that more accurately when I was actually in corporate, because the last 4 to 5 years of my corporate journey, I actually coached mid-level managers through leadership.
Okay.
And the answer was yes. The answer was yes. Now, I would say I always had it's a gift, I realized later on, of creating safety for people to be able to share. So every manager did not share personal things with every coach that they worked with, right? I just had that ability to create safety so that they would share. And the answer is yes, they do share. And the thing about corporate and your professional life is, at the end of the day, you are the same person with a personal life and a professional life. And they, as much as we used to like to say they're two separate things, they are not. Right? When you show up to work to be a leader, you're still navigating, the child that's not acting right in school, right? You're still navigating being a caretaker because your mom has dementia. Like, it's not two separate worlds. It's the same world. And I used to talk to a lot of leaders in terms of how do you manage this personal world and still show up as an effective leader. And it's not easy to do that in the corporate space all the time because you still have boundaries. Right. Remember when I said at the beginning, like I wanted to create more impact and I wanted to have the freedom to be able to kind of coach in that way. That's kind of one of the areas I wanted to do that. I didn't want people to feel like they couldn't share certain things or there were certain boundaries because we were in a corporate space. Now I don't have that issue because if someone comes to me, I am the boundary, right? I manage what happens within, but it comes up a lot. And in the corporate space, people are dealing with a lot of burnout. You were experiencing that, right? In your role. Burnout is something that is happening a lot. The economy is not helping people to find alternative jobs, so they kind of feel stuck with where they are because the options are limited. And it is risky. I would not, unless someone has a plan, I would never say, oh, just like you said earlier, just leap.
Right.
You gotta know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so yes, it did come up quite a bit, the personal piece, because you really can't separate it. If you tell people to bring their authentic selves to work, there's no way that you can separate what's happening with them personally and professionally. That's not authenticity if they have to separate it.
Right. And I'm glad that you broke that down because I think the reason why it came into my spirit, because so often, when we're thinking about professional and then personal, you can't separate it. But when I was in college, it's like, oh, yes, you have to be professional in the setting and not be, share personal things. But I'm learning now that when you are not necessarily even like building an audience, but just developing a relationship with your colleagues, your clients, you have to have that, demeanor as far as like how much personal you want to share, but then also it's like to make it more relatable and to connect, as you mentioned, the safety. And I'm learning that that's my gift also, but I asked God for years, like, how do I package that into like, a business? Because people felt very safe with me to just open about anything at work. And I'm like, okay, boundaries. Like, I didn't know what that even meant until a few years ago. So, yeah.
You definitely...
They won't just open up like freely when they feel safe. Yeah.
Because they felt safe, right? You have to use wisdom with who you share it with and how you share it in the corporate space, But yeah, we are one person managing multiple areas of our lives. And so it's kind of unfair to ask people to separate that, but I get it because being in corporate HR for 25 years, when I first started in HR, you better not talk about your personal life. Nobody cares about your personal issues. Now it's a little bit different, and a lot of organizations are trying to embrace the fact that bringing your authentic self to work means that I have to be a leader that understands that, hey, my person is not going to be able to perform very well today because they're dealing with grief or they're dealing with this, but there are a lot of organizations that still don't get it right in that area, unfortunately.
Oh, right, absolutely. But it allows us to be human. Life happens, so it just allowing us to be human. And I feel like it's easier to talk about, pivoting when it comes to like a business. Okay, how do I restructure? How do I reshape this? But like an area that I struggle with is like, how do we pivot in our personal lives, when you're going through that change? So last year, even with my pastor, we talked about the power of pivoting because there is power that comes from it. But like you mentioned, giving us that time to be still, because that's something that has to be learned. You have to learn how to be still and not just say, go to sleep, sleep it off because you can't, so.
Yeah, because we live in a very hustle, busy, noisy culture.
Yes.
Being still and rest is the complete opposite of that, right? And it's going to be more natural, but it's so necessary.
Well, this is a wonderful conversation, and I just love this. I feel like this needs to be like a continuation, so I may have to call you for another season to talk about it because this is like really good, and transition is ongoing. So, like you mentioned, like midlife, you're possibly going through like an empty nest and like just navigating that space. Like, what would that look like, for you? So there's different versions and different seasons that require a transition coach. So yeah,
absolutely. Even as you go through your change as women, our bodies are changing, and empty nesting, and you start thinking about retirement when you get up in your 50s, 60s. So yeah, transition is an ongoing life journey.
Yes, and we have a comment in the chat. Hello, Ms. Hunter. I really appreciate the conversation tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. And yes, you mentioned that it was very refreshing for her and many gems tonight. So thank you so much, Ms. Hunter, for joining us. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. And to close us out, I would like for you to share if you have a quote, scripture, or inspirational thought for any of our viewers or just in general for anyone that may be going through a transition season. What is the inspirational thought, scripture, or quote you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I'll share a quote, and it's very short, and I'll share a scripture. So the quote is, "Broken crayons still color." I have loved that like for a very long time. And in fact, I kind of use that to name my book, my book is called Broken Hearts Still Shine.
Nice.
Right. And the message there is it doesn't matter, a broken crayon is still going to color, and you don't need perfection in order to move your life forward. Right. There will be bumps, there will be changes, there'll be adversity, which ties into my scripture, which is Psalm 147:3, that says that God heals the brokenhearted and he binds up their wounds. And I think for anyone that's listening, I just want to encourage you, like, it doesn't matter how hard the season feels or how difficult it looks or how discouraged you might feel in this moment. That was the scripture that I stood on in my darkest season when I was going through divorce. Like, even though I felt like I was never going to get through that, God promises us that he heals the brokenhearted and he binds up all their wounds. And so that's my favorite scripture, and that's what I would offer. But for anyone listening, find a scripture that you are able to hold on to that promise and keep that promise in your heart, no matter what you see, feel, or think, and know that God is always going to fulfill and do what he says he's going to do.
Yes, amen. Thank you so much for that quote and scripture. And I know you just mentioned that you have a book, and earlier you mentioned that you have a framework. So how can people connect with you? And do you have any, do you offer virtual sessions?
Yeah, so I'll kind of quickly share. So LenaWilson.com is my website, right? My name, Lena, L-E-N-A, LenaWilson.com. And you can find almost everything that you need there on that site. On Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. TikTok is where I am the most right now. It's at Coach Lena Wilson. That's my handle on pretty much all the platforms. So if you go to my website, if you want to work with me, you can schedule time for us to have like a complimentary 30-minute conversation so I can support you and understand kind of what you need support with. The one thing I do want to share, because you mentioned the book. I mentioned the book. So you can get my book on the website, Broken Hearts Still Shine. There are also 2 free digital products that I want to highlight. If you are like in the process of trying to figure out your next career move, there is a free career transition guide that's really helpful. You can pull that complimentary on the site. And then there's also like another digital guide that's also complimentary, 6 tips to navigating change in your life, just to kind of give you something to think through. And the last thing I want to share is actually next Thursday, for anyone who has navigated a divorce or a breakup and you are thinking about dating again, I am doing a class that's called Dating After Divorce and Dating in Midlife. And it's really just helping people to overcome fears that they may have around dating, helping them to get clear, because the theme is not just dating after divorce or dating in midlife. It's about how do you find a calm path to healthy love, where your nervous system is in a calm, peaceful space, finding healthy love, not chaotic, not confusion, you know. And so that's next Thursday. If you go to my site, you will also see that at the top, the banner. I'd love to have you, and it's pretty. It's $25 for the class, and so you're welcome to join that class for anyone that's listening.
Yes, that's going to be a wonderful class. I already know it. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was so amazing to hear your background and to hear all the tools that helped you and to help your clients. So I just pray that everyone on tonight will continue to thrive if they are in a transition season and know that there is support out there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And also, if you're available, come next Thursday for our episode. We're actually, Miss Lena, going to be talking about also a self-love journey and what does love look like after divorce. So that's our topic next week. So thank you. Join Miss Lena, her session that she has next week, and please still be connected. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.